Welcome back to the Practical Spirituality Podcast. We are so excited to have you on this journey with us, where we explore all elements of mind, body, emotions, and soul through the lens of everyday life. In this week's episode, I share my journey of addiction, how it began, what happened, what it's like now, and the spiritual insights I gained along the way.
I believe on this week's episode, we're going to be talking about addiction.
I think that's kind of what we landed on, isn't it?
Well, as we both know, there's so many different ways in which we can approach the subject of addiction. And it is something that I know we're going to come back to time and time again. But for this particular episode, I feel we both want to focus on actually talking about your in-depth experience with addiction within your own journey throughout life. Coming into this, we don't have any script or any plan necessarily, but we're just going to flow with it and to see what it brings up in mind, body, emotions, and soul, as well as the experiences that have shaped you into becoming the incredible person you are today.
Thank you.
And I genuinely look forward to hearing and sharing your story with everyone listening. And I look forward to this episode being about Kim. So where would you like to start?
To start it off, I'd just like to say that, this is about my story, and it could be very different for so many different people because, as we've often said, it's a lot of different people. There's no cookie cutter, but we each have our own individual experience.
Yep.
So maybe if we start, let me just tell you what the definition, if someone looked up addiction, what they'd get for a definition. So the definition of addiction is a state of psychological or physical dependence, or both, on the use of alcohol or other drugs. The term is often used as an equivalent term for substance dependence and sometimes applied to behavioral disorders, such as sexual, internet, and gambling addictions. Mm-hmm. That is the clinical definition of addiction.
And there's, of course, different variations of those definitions also.
Absolutely. And so many people say that it is a disease. Like there's the disease concept, there's the trauma concept, there's a concept that it's genetic, hereditary, onward we go. Do I know if any of those are correct? In the beginning, when I first got clean and sober, I went with the disease aspect. And I don't know if I necessarily argue that, but it's not my point of view today.
Yeah. So as you mentioned at the start of this episode, is that we're going to be coming at it from your experience or your angle or the journey you've done with your addiction. So where would you like to start?
I think that's hilarious because quite often you would have heard me say over the years, I think I was born an addict. I don't necessarily really believe that. After all these years and all the work that I've done on myself, I quite often will refer back to my early childhood because I talk about in my early childhood when I was like 3 years old, I was diagnosed as hyperactive. And then right before I started school, I was put on medication for that. And I think what's funny about that is I can remember prior to going to Canada, my mom constantly saying why a person has to stay away from marijuana because marijuana is a feeder drug and it's going to cause you to go to heroin and everything else. And I remember thinking that's a bit extreme by that time. But having been on the medication for the hyperactivity, and I was only on it for a few years, I still struggled in school. I had quite a few traumas. So anybody who's worked with me, they've often heard the spiel about the different traumas that I've gone through.
Yep.
Might just give a quick little rundown.
Yeah.
So when I was 8, my mom almost passed away. She didn't, but the priest came and gave her last rites and we had to say goodbye. And I went with my father to pick out coffins. My mom survived, but then she left and went to Canada and stayed with her mom for a while. And while she was gone, my brother fell off the high dive and landed half in the water and half on the concrete. We were in the pool and witnessed it. And I also was sexually abused that same year. So that was a year I was 8 years of age and quite a bit of trauma. I think, Gareth, the other thing I want to say about this is for so long, in fact, as long as I can remember, I didn't feel like I fit. I didn't feel like I fit with my family. I didn't feel like I fit with life. I felt different and odd and uncomfortable in my own skin. So basically what happened was when I was about to turn 14 or just after I turned 14, my mom decided we needed to meet our relatives up in Canada. So my dad decked out our van as a camper van, and she took me and 6 of my brothers, and we camped our way from Memphis, Tennessee, all the way up to Newfoundland, Canada. Quite the adventure. Me, the only girl, and my 6 brothers, who loved to give me all kinds of grief. When we got there, my mom very promptly had had enough. And so she said, you're going to stay with your aunt and her daughters. Well, for me, that felt like she just didn't want me and she was trying to pan me off. So I went and stayed with my aunt. And my cousins were pretty excited because, I had this really Southern accent. I thought they were speaking a different language because they had such thick Irish accents. So half the time I just stood there nodding my head yes, because I had no idea what they were saying. And my cousins decided that I was way too naive and that they wanted to introduce me to alcohol and cigarettes because I was 14 and they couldn't believe I hadn't really been going at it by then. So we went out one night and I tried all these different types of beer. Quite a few of them I liked. I was getting quite a little buzz on. We were trying all these cigarettes. As we went through the cigarettes, I kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. Then one of my cousins said to me, I've got the one that you'll really like. Here, try this one. I was very naive. I thought it was a cigarette. I took one hit off this and every cell of my body felt like it went into relax mode. And I went, is this what normal people feel like? And as I often say to people, and my addiction was born. And so from that point forward, I spent 3 solid months in Canada, drinking, smoking weed, partying, having a great time. I went from about 95 pounds to 145 pounds in 3 months. Got home and my dad cried, said to my mother, what'd you do to my daughter? You ruined her. But the bigger problem when I got back to our house after that summer was I had had a paper out. I still had a paper out. All I knew was I needed the weed. I needed the weed like nothing else. The alcohol I could sneak from my parents. I've been doing that a little bit. That wasn't a big deal, but I needed the weed. And I say that's when the addiction was born. A lot of people say what comes first, the chicken or the egg. When I look at the family history, because I think that's only fair, my mom was Irish Catholic. She came from a very Irish family. I would say that out of 11 kids that survived, there were probably 8 of them that were alcoholics. My dad's side of the family, he had a brother and a sister who were alcoholics. Was it the genetics? Was it the trauma? I don't know. I think it was a combination of all. So that's the beginning. And from there, I didn't think it was a problem. First time I knew it was a problem was, I had been going and collecting money from people's houses on the paper route so that I could buy weed. And it came time to pay my paper bill and I didn't know who I'd gotten money from, who I hadn't. But when I was 17, my dad said to me one night, you know what, Kim, you have a problem. You have a problem with alcohol and drugs and you either get some help or you need to move out. So I very promptly gave him the salute, said, see you later. But I think I need to back up and tell you this beforehand. When I was 16, I had been taken to the hospital twice and got my stomach pumped because of alcohol. So when that had happened, the doctors had told me, you're highly allergic to alcohol. You can't drink. And I remember being in that hospital room going, yeah, I know my mom put you up to that. So it's okay. No worries. And he's like, no, seriously, you can't drink. I'm like, no, it's okay. I get it. And so from 16 to 26, I went at it pretty hard. Moved out and things went downhill very quickly from that point forward. But what I can say, and what the very definition to me is, did I have a change of personality? Absolutely, I did. Did I continue to use despite the negative consequences? Absolutely, I did. I'm not proud to say this, but I remember towards the end, I was trying so hard to get clean. And I had a day where I couldn't stand it. And I drove from West Palm Beach, Florida, all the way to South Beach, Miami for one joint. So as you know, it's like a 2.5, 3 hour drive. It took 5-10 minutes. And I was already not stoned again by the time I got home, which was pretty devastating. I think the thing that most people get confused about is I felt like I was a pretty high functioning alcoholic and addict. I never lost a job. I showed up. I might have been hungover. I might have not been able to perform very well, but I never missed a day of work. I went to work, still not proud of it, but that is kind of how I function. I went to some pretty dark places with some pretty dark people. as you've often heard me say on this podcast, there for the grace of God go I, because I don't know how I survived some of them, but I did.
There's some details, obviously, that you're mentioning on this episode, and out of all the different experiences and stories you've shared with myself and listeners, you've mentioned some specifics of some of the traumas when you were 8 years old. Let it be the near-death experience with your mom and that trauma, the trauma with your brother and his accident, but then also the sexual abuse that occurred all when you were 8 years old. I know from the listeners and for people that actually have asked us on Patreon or even in person, when it comes to sacred contracts, divine design, and even when we would say we chose all of this, it's just our immediate instinct is I didn't choose those traumas to be a part of my life, and we just want to fight that understanding so much. For someone who's been on a similar journey to you with similar traumas, how do you begin to actually do that healing journey of coming to a place of marrying in the understandings that we've been talking about on this podcast with the mental and emotional, physical and spiritual journey, getting to a place of healing, acceptance, whatever that might look like for you or any person for that matter?
So one of the things I would first say, Gareth, is it took a long time before I married those concepts together.
Yep.
Like there was no way in the beginning of my recovery that you could have convinced me of anything that we're talking about here on the podcast.
Yep.
The denial was very strong. Like as people might have heard me say, I was 26 when I stopped drinking, stopped using drugs, and got into recovery. And I do like to mention that I used a 12-step program, and I used that 12-step program for a long time because I had no support anywhere else. And it literally saved my life in so many aspects. It worried me because there were a lot of rules. Being raised in a military family, and I rebelled against rules constantly, I didn't give myself a lot of hope. In fact, in the beginning, I only gave myself 6 months. I actually gave them 6 months, and I went, after 6 months, I'm out of here. But the interesting thing that happened was after 6 months, I started to feel much better. But if you had said to me, oh, this is in your sacred contract, Kim, I would have said, you know what? You don't have any clue what you're talking about. Get out of my face.
Yeah.
That's what I would have said to you. It wasn't until many, 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 many years later, and I'm not talking a few years, I'm talking quite a bit of life experience, as you guys have heard me say quite a few times, of my head being dunked under the water, even while sober.
Yep.
Before I even could consider it. I want to say till after my brother Kurt died and I was 12 years clean before I could even open my mind to it. And the reason for that is in the beginning, I believed in the disease concept. And so that was great because, the disease concept relieved me of a little bit of responsibility. It was like, oh, it's not really me, you see. It's not my fault. I have a disease. And, I don't know whether that's true or not. And I'm going to say that honestly because I've never gone out and questioned it, because by the time I got to the end of my drinking and my using of drugs, it was pretty bad. And so my family had disowned me at one stage, so I didn't really ever want to test that again. So as we talk about how do I link it back to that, I think it was I got clean. I went to the 12-step program. I did everything that everybody told me to do. I went to psychologist. I went to psychiatrist. I got told I was a hopeless cause, and I was getting angrier and angrier and angrier because all I wanted was to get back to that feeling when I took that first hit off that first joint, was feeling comfortable in my skin. I can honestly say that I didn't care about sacred contracts. I didn't care about anything else. I was just trying to figure out how to keep my head above water.
Yep.
I had lots of people trying to tell me, I remember people talking about the spiritual aspect. You have to turn your will and life over to the care of God as you understand him. I tried that, and I did do that, and I would take it back as quick as I gave it because I was deep into control at that stage.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that's wrong, but there's a spiritual concept out there that says one of the reasons we're addicted is because we're absent of, a faith or a higher power or a religion or a belief. I didn't agree with that because I was raised Catholic. I always had a strong connection with the higher power. Even through my addiction, I walked through some pretty hairy situations, and I always knew that my spiritual connection was what got me through that.
Yep.
It didn't stop the addiction though. And all the times I said, that's it. That's the last time. Didn't stop that either. So the only thing in the beginning was just don't pick up no matter what. Now I have to get really clear here because this is a very important point when it comes to me and my journey. Years later, when I started working at a drug and alcohol rehab, and I was learning about the neurobiology of addiction, we were told that most addicts and alcoholics have about 7 attempts at recovery before anything sticks. And of course, the self-righteous Kim, that's not what happened for me. First time I decided to get sober, that was it. Until the lecturer said, really? That's interesting. So you only ever said once that you're never going to pick up a drink again. And I went, well, seriously. But he helped me see that I did have several attempts. And so after having all of those attempts, and I finally went, okay, well, I actually had 3 events happen to me. And the last event that happened to me was it was a suicide attempt. I talked to people about it before. My father had passed away 2 years prior. That's when, my brothers had said, enough, lose the phone number. We don't want to know you while you're still drinking. And then I went back, my relationship ended, and I truthfully didn't think I could stay alive. So I had the suicide attempt in the ocean. I was a scuba diver. I was at the bottom of the ocean, decided to turn off my air. My tank ran, dried up, and I started to lose consciousness right about the time that my dive buddy found me. All I remember is kind of coming to with him shoving his regulator in my mouth. He pulled me up on the boat. He started working on me. He was angry as all hell. He was so mad at me. And I was sitting at the front of that boat thinking, oh my gosh, I can't even kill myself. This is pretty bad. I mean, I've messed everything up and I can't even kill myself. But as I was sitting there and I was feeling really bad, he called out to me and he threw a beer at me and he said, here, have one of these. Maybe you'll feel better. And as I sat there holding that beer and I was looking at it, I heard this voice in my head that said, maybe, just maybe, if you put the alcohol down long enough, you'll find out why your life's so messed up. It's a little bit more colorful language than that, but that's the gist of it. And my head whipped around because I thought it was my dive buddy, but he was back at the engine, starting the engines. And at that point I was like, oh my gosh. And what transpired after that was 3 days of an absolute emotional breakdown. So he dropped me off. I don't think he wanted to know me anymore after that because it would have been a lot of trouble for him if I had succeeded. And I spent 3 days in my apartment, probably the worst 3 days of my life. So then that's when somebody came by, knocked on the door. They invited me to a 12-step program and I started that journey. So now let's go fast forward to when my brother died 12 years later.
Yep.
My brother passes away. It's about a couple weeks later. And I get up in the morning, I go into the kitchen and I'm trying to get started. And I just have this overwhelming compulsion to use. And it took me by surprise. And I ended up on the kitchen floor rocking back and forth because every single cell in my body wanted to use. And it was strong. It had happened to me before over the years, but I had always been close to an AA meeting or could pick up the phone and call somebody. At this point, I had 3 kids. And all I kept saying to myself is, this too will pass. This too will pass. At the end of that, it was like 4 hours later, I got up. As you guys have heard me say, I was mad as hell. I was mad at God. I was mad at the psychologist. I was mad at the psychiatrist. I was mad at the 12-step program. I was like, everybody can go get stuffed. Because I was so angry that I knew in that moment it was not about alcohol and drugs. I knew that I didn't have the ability to deal with the emotional stuff and the trauma that was starting to surface that I could no longer keep bottled in. And so that is at the point of the journey where my life started to change because, it had changed exponentially. I don't want to give people the wrong idea. I was married. I had 3 small kids. Life looked very successful from the outside, but I was really crippled with anxiety, crippled with fear, couldn't move forward. When I started searching in another direction is when I came across this concept of sacred contracts. And I was trying to make sense of why everything had happened to me in my life. Why was I the alcoholic and addict? Why did I have the traumas? Why does everybody else get to have a nice life and I'm here still struggling? But on the other hand of that, I was thinking, because by that time I'd started working at a drug and alcohol center, why did I get clean and sober? And so many people I'm watching not be able to make it. And that used to baffle me because I couldn't understand, why did I stay clean? Why aren't they staying clean?
Yep.
So that was the point when I started to marry it up because I started looking out of mainstream. I started looking at spiritual concepts. I started looking at spiritual books. I started reading personal development books. And I was searching for an answer as to what that was about. Hi there. We hope you're enjoying this week's episode. We've been so delighted to see such a fantastic response to the show. And we're excited to now offer you a way to get even more from the podcast. We've been building our Patreon community and are now offering a range of benefits, including weekly bonus episodes, articles, early access to our regular episodes, and weekly check-in polls. And here's something special. We are hosting monthly live question and answer sessions, a fantastic chance to interact directly with us and get your questions answered. We've designed different tiers on Patreon, ensuring there's something for everyone. Find your fit and join us by clicking the link in the episode description or visiting www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. We're excited to welcome you to our Patreon community. Let's continue our journey in practical spirituality together.
Once you realized for Kim that for her journey that she had to go back and actually look at the emotional traumas, the triggers, these realities that were happening in your life, what were the specific therapies, support groups, even spiritual understandings that really helped you on that journey?
I was already going to 12-step programs.
Yep.
And on that particular day that happened to me, I went to a meeting that night and I shared what had happened. And there were a few people in the meeting that shamed me for sharing that because I was 12 years sober and I was painting a not so great, pretty picture of recovery. And that frustrated me even more because this was my safe place. And so from that moment forward, I started to feel like that particular program was no longer safe for me. It was like they wanted to pigeonhole me into this little thing and keep me stuck there. And I could only tell the side of the story that looked good instead of telling the truth about what was happening. And that really was scary for me because I once again felt like I was stuck out in the cold all by myself, trying to figure out how to navigate this nightmare that was kind of showing up. I had anxiety to the hilt. I had all these emotions I didn't know what to deal with. And I was starting to have these traumas come to the surface that I didn't know what to do. As I mentioned, I was working at a drug and alcohol recovery program, and I was studying the neurobiology of addiction. And I didn't even want to mention it to them because I was afraid I would be shamed as well. We had just gotten a new therapist for the people in the rehab to go to. And so I needed to go and check that therapist out. I know you can tell that I'm smiling because it's such a fond memory for me because I went to go see this therapist and she had no credentials. So I knew at that point I already liked her because she didn't have any credentials, which is the rebel in me. But I wanted to see what she was going to be talking to the clients about. I didn't want a whole bunch of this yucky stuff that I had already gone through. And so I sat down and did a session with her and kind of I can't even remember the first session. I was so blown away by some of the things that she approached in me that no one had ever gone to. So I was like, oh, so I worked very closely. I modeled my work after her. And she was, if I look back now, and I would quite honestly say an angel on my path. I think she was heavily guided. She always seemed to have the answers that I needed. And she continued to take me back to understanding what those traumas meant to me, why I couldn't cope with those traumas, and how to stay present. She is the person who taught me present moment awareness that we've talked about.
Yep.
And she laid a bet for me. And so that was the first step. And from there, I went on to study quite a few different things. You know, I studied neurolinguistic programming, which is all about how our language affects what we do. I studied hypnotherapy. I studied emotional freedom technique. Then I studied faster emotional freedom technique. I liked all of them.
Yep.
But by the time I got to the last one, what had happened was I had neurobiology of addiction. I had some of the spiritual concepts from the therapist that I was using. And when this guy started talking about how to go back and change the perception of what you were holding, I understood what he was talking about, and I understood how powerful that could be. Now, there was still a couple steps to the program that needed to be added, but that was the point when I went, you know what? This isn't too woo-woo. It's not mainstream. But the most important part about it was I started using these particular techniques together on myself with the help of someone else, and I started getting significant changes. That's kind of how it all transpired. That's what went down. Do I think it's the only way? No. Do I think that there's many different ways? Yes, I do. I think what I probably want to say more than anything, Gareth, at this point about, some of the misconceptions of addiction. My family told me so many times, just stop, just say no. I was an addict at the time of Nancy Reagan's program in the United States saying, just say no. And I remember I'd hear it on the radio or on TV and I'd think, you know what? If I could say no, don't you think I would? Like it was such a compulsion, because this is why I go back to the trauma and the emotions when it came to the addiction. I had no way of dealing with that. No one had ever helped me with that. And so knowing the neurobiology of addiction the way I did, there was a loop in my head that would say, you know what to do, go do it, and you'll feel better. And it was so compulsive that the minute it would hit, it was almost as if you couldn't deny that. And all I ever wanted was to be out of the pain.
And what was interesting there is that you actually mentioned your family's comments on your addiction. It's quite incredible how a lot of people have a lot of opinions on addiction without actually anyone have ever been having exposure to it, educated on it. But I guess for you, on your journey, what are some of the misconceptions you had about addiction before you even realized that you were an addict yourself?
So I can remember people talking about alcoholics, in my teens and in my early 20s when I was very much an active alcoholic. And I just thought, it's not me. I thought an alcoholic was, a homeless person on the side of the street drinking out of a paper bag. That's what I thought an alcoholic was. I thought an addict was a heroin addict that was there shooting up. I didn't realize that, some of the first drugs that I used that got me into some really big trouble, I just thought that they were like the ADHD medication. I just thought, oh yeah, well, it helps me stay alert, helps me get my job done. It's no big deal. It's fine. And even through those early 20s, when things kept going badly, there were negative consequences, I always had an excuse for it. Always had an excuse. I moved from the middle of America to Florida, the party city, the party city of the world, just about in North America. And so I was in good company. There was a lot of people partying. Like people were partying all the time. And so I just thought this was normal. It took a long time before I started to realize. And my dive buddy that I told you about, he was also a bartender. And I can remember at one stage towards the end of my drinking and my addiction, he cut me off. And I remember being so indignant going, what are you talking about? You're my drinking buddy. How dare you cut me off? And he was like, you're done. And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm just going to go to another bar. Like I just didn't understand, and I couldn't see because of the denial how far it was taking me. Some of the misconceptions around my family and what my family thought I had no control.
No willpower?
I had no willpower, no control. If I really wanted to, I could stop. And that I was just wanted to party. Like that, I don't think they had any idea the level of pain that I was in on a regular basis. And if you talk to any addict, any recovering addict, because most addicts won't let themselves get to that pain point because the pain starts to set in and the brain says, you know what to do, go get it. Do it again. And even though there's a part of us going, I never want to do it again, the pain is too great. And so the pain outweighs the other part. Quite often when I talk to people today and, when I worked in drug and alcohol, I often talk about how I made a decision. I made a decision that weekend when life was really bad. And it's really easy to gloss over that. Like it was a suicide attempt. I went home. I spent 3 solid days crying my eyes out. I was so upset because I thought I can't live and I can't die. I'm in hell. And so I thought I'm either going to figure out how to live or I'm going to have a speedy death, and that's the moment I knew that things were going to change. Now, that wasn't willpower. That was, I heard you talk about it when you were saying you went to the depths of hell. And that's kind of what it felt like for me that weekend, those 3 days of just pure hell. And it was like, I didn't feel like I had a choice. I had to figure out how to live and how to get clean.
You know a question I'm going to ask you next, right?
No. What?
So, Kim, why did you choose this as part of your sacred contract?
Oh, God. Oh, this has taken so long to work out. So I'm sure everybody has heard me say over this certain podcast over the time, that I'd get my head above water and feel like I'd get dunked down again. Like when I finally got to the 12-step program, from that point on, I didn't pick up or use again.
Yep.
Now, that doesn't mean I was happy, joyous, and free like they promised me. I certainly wasn't at all, as you've heard me just say, but I never picked up. And so through the years of trying to find my way out of this hellhole that I thought I was in, this hellhole that was Kim, because I couldn't live with Kim. Kim was intolerable at that stage in my life. So as I started to grow and as I found these alternative therapies that I used and started slowly making some progress, one of the things that had happened is my brother passed away. And my brother and I had the same spiritual beliefs. So I said to him, okay, you get to the other side. You know what the job is. You got to get me the answers and get them back. 2 years after that event that happened on my kitchen floor, I went to a 12-step meeting and a woman came walking up to me and she said, I know you don't know me and I don't know why I've done this, but I was compelled to buy you this book and I have to give it to you because I've heard your story and I think this is a book for you. And I remember looking at her thinking, oh, that is so weird. And she said, do me a favor, please don't open it up till you get home. So I'd left the meeting. Where I lived was like 30 minutes away from my house. I drove. I got to the last intersection before my house and I opened up the bag and the book was Conversations with God, book 1. And I started reading it and I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed because I felt like Kurt was talking to me through that book. And there was a lot of things in that book that were starting to make sense for me on the emotional journey that I was on. It started to validate some of the feelings that I had had and started to help me understand that, you know what, it's not all by accident. And so it was a tough read. And after that, when I was doing this looking and growing, I started to realize it can't be all in vain. I can tell you, Gareth, it wasn't until about 10 years ago, I was sitting with a client and this client had had a horrendous past. And it was my very first session with that client. And that client had a reaction. And in that moment, I knew what to do because of everything had happened in my life. And that was the moment it all made sense. That was the moment I could go, oh, that's what all that was about. That's why I had to go through every single one of those events so that I could be here right now helping this person. After having that experience with my client, one of the things that I really started to understand is if I hadn't had every single one of those experiences, I wouldn't have been equipped for that moment. And so we talk about it all the time. We talk about our sacred contracts. We talk about there's no choice. We talk about how our energy chose this for us. The first probably 37, 40 years of my life, I would have told you can take that and put it where the sun doesn't shine. But after this moment, I was like, oh, it's like the penny dropped. I can see that the addiction wasn't a choice. I can see the traumas wasn't really that choice. It wasn't the choice of this personality. I needed to go through every single one of those events that happened, and there were many, so that I could be here today helping people along their journey. And one of the things I often say, Gareth, is this. As I went through this journey, I felt like the coal miner who had been in a collapsed mine, trying to find my own way out. And when I got to the end of that part of the journey, I was like, oh, if I hadn't dug this tunnel to get out, I wouldn't be able to share it with anybody else. And I think that's one of the things that we're saying when we talk about our sacred contracts and we talk about these choices that were made by that part of us that's connected to that universal energy, is that we know what we're here to experience, but our personality doesn't. And so I think part of that journey is coming to terms and finding out how to, understand it and be at peace with it. So just to conclude, I don't really think anybody chooses to be an addict. I don't think anybody ever wants to experience that, on a conscious level. But I think on a spiritual level, we go through these events in our life, whether it is drug addiction, alcoholism, gambling, love addiction, internet addiction, gaming addiction. All of those things that we go through are part of what we're here to learn about ourselves and to grow and evolve. Because without them, we're not going to get to this place of understanding of ourselves. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to explore these topics more with us, please go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. Not only will that help us keep producing these shows, but you'll also get advance access to each new episode, the opportunity to ask questions directly of Gareth and I, input into what topics we will cover on the show, access to exclusive content not available anywhere else. See you over on Patreon.